At 0300 Galactic Central Time last night, a pirate faction known as Spart attacked and captured an experimental military base in the Glau system. Upon securing the facility, they utilized the security codes in conjunction with the experimental technology aboard the station to hack thousands of civilians' vessels, seizing control of their remote block and weapon systems. Hundreds of non-combatants died in the aftermath, and thousands more found themselves forced to flee their ships only to be stranded in space. The Galactic Federation's ships in the sector immediately moved to remedy the situation, only to be obliterated by dozens of remotely controlled pirated civilian vessels. Under normal circumstances, the Federation would send an armada to crush these pirates. Alas, any sizable force would be detected light years away and be met with every pirated vessel Spart has hijacked, resulting in considerable damage to both the armada and the pirated vessels. The Federation wishes to forgo such damages. And this is where you come into play. Under the guise of a humanitarian ship, you will be inserted into the Glau solar system and dropped on an Earth-like planet within the sector. Your mission is to remain undetected while constructing a vessel capable of assaulting and destroying the captured military station. Good luck, and may the Lord go with you.
LordMaddog's fingers drummed away on his cockpit seat as he slowly twirled down towards the ground. He had trained all of his life for this, but doing it in actual fact was another matter. He was the only one of his kind, a combat engineer, and if he succeeded this, he would prove the validity of his profession. Reaching the ground, he set to work doing the numerous various tasks he would need to complete to turn his small drop pod into a formidable mining vessel, which was quite considerable. First, he had to gather a boatload of stone to be able to construct the parts he would need, which would be a pain. He'd also have to go through all of the unlocking blocks, just like any other normal civilian, which was also going to be irksome, to say the least. The idea of not having any mods or scripts at hand to complete his task was a daunting one. But he would succeed. He was certain of that. He would just take some patience. And tons and tons of drilling. Oh, his least favorite pastime, drilling by hand. At least he knew how to do it quite well by now. Drilling down deep into the earth where you would find the stone crust, and then chipping away at the stone to get more stone and fill your inventory was a tiresome task, but one anyone can complete, especially one with his training. With his inventory full of stone, he made his way back to his ship and deposited it into his vessel. Once he queued the survival kit to start production of the first set of parts he would need and sift out the various materials in the stone, he set to work grinding down the front end of his drop pod. First, though, he needed to grab what he had left in the seat: his rifle, some ammo, and a data pad given to him by one of the officers of the military ship, detailing the location of a trade station nearby, which would be quite helpful later on. With those in his inventory, he went ahead and grinded down the seat and the other various parts on the front of the cockpit. With those out of the place, he went ahead and took off the hydrogen thruster as well, something he wouldn't need, but had quite a few parts that would be useful for later. Now, with all of that out of the way, he had direct access to the internals of the drop pod. First, he decided to grind down a few of the conveyor tubes and replace them with conveyor junctions. But to do that, he'd also have to grind down the small cargo container to gain access to the junction boxes. That was a pain, but no big deal. Carefully grinding down the cargo pod and then welding it back up, he unlocked the necessary blocks, then quickly placed the junctions he needed. With the junctions in place, he welded them up using the materials he had obtained from grinding down the seat. Now, he could place the cockpit. The problem was, he didn't have enough material to finish welding it up. he would need at least 4 more loads full of stone to do that. Something he was not looking forward to. But drilling by hand was a necessity, especially if you were doing what he had to do. Sometime later, he finally had enough resources to fully weld up the cockpit. Well, except for silicone. And he wasn't going to mess with the bulletproof glass. He didn't need that at this time. Now, with the cockpit in place, he had control over the vessel. The only problem, there was no way of actually moving it or controlling its direction, so he had to put some gyros on it. Gyros. Wonderful little devices that would enable you to turn in any direction that you wished using the control seat. The only problem was they required large steel tubes, which he had a very, very limited amount of access to at the very moment, due to the fact that large steel tubes could only be produced in an actual assembler, something he didn't actually have yet. Which means he would also have to start grinding down his thrusters, his atmospheric thrusters. There are 4 on his pod, for stability reasons. He didn't want to remove them, but he would have to remove them to gain access to all the large steel tubes he needed. So that's what he did. After grinding them down and welding up the gyros, he finally was able to do what he really wanted to do. Add a drill to his escape pod, or drop pod, as it were, because it wasn't exactly escaping from anything. The only problem was he needed more steel plates. Again, for the umpteenth time. Yeah. It was time to go back and drill more stone by hand. Hopefully, though, this would be the last time. Now, with steel plate in hand, he welded up the drill and then happily hopped to his cockpit and readjusted the controls to be able to control the drill from his seat. No more drilling by hand, he thought to himself as he started up the drill and very cautiously began to drill the dirt around him, gathering all the stone in one fell swoop. It was a delicate process, of course. He had to be very careful not to break the bottom of his drop pod or get himself stuck, which eventually he knew he probably would end up doing anyway. But at least he wasn't having to drill by hand. Yes, he thought to himself as he continued to drill away. And, yes, as he suspected, he eventually did get himself stuck. But at least now he had enough stone to complete his next leg of the task. Freeing himself with his drill from the little hole he had dug, he set about using the build planner to set up the next pieces he would need. An assembler, something to power it, so either a battery or a windmill, and probably a refinery, but he didn't actually need the refinery as yet, so he chose to forgo that particular piece of machinery for the moment. As his drop pod whirled and clicked away, he decided, for the first time, to take a look around and see what he could see. It was a beautiful grass valley, but as he stared at everything and took in the sight, he suddenly realized he was dropped in the worst possible place. There was no ice in view anywhere, and being in the middle of a valley means he would have to climb all the way out to see if he could find any other ore patches or stones. It was probably some of the worst luck possible. because it meant he had very limited amount of hydrogen for his jetpack. And he would have to either build a ship capable of flying out of the valley or walk out of the valley, unless he wanted to actually have to walk everywhere, including while he built, which was not something he looked forward to in the least bit. Well, this was the way of a combat engineer. Sometimes you had good luck, sometimes the world just decided to spit at you, or take a dump on you. As his instructor used to say, it's all in the mind. See the problem and just deal with it. Don't think about it. And his current problem was he actually needed more stone to complete all the pieces he needed. Which meant his drop pod would end up getting more stuck in the dirt. But that wasn't that big of a problem. He would just dig it out after he obtained all the large steel tubes he needed to once again recreate the thrusters. It'd be a pain, but it wasn't something he couldn't deal with. So dig away he did, ever getting himself more and more stuck. The life of a combat engineer. Extricating himself from his hole, he pulled out the parts he would need to construct the assembler, and then grabbed the data pad. He might as well go ahead and look how far he needed to travel to get to the trade station. Hopefully, it wasn't too far. 11.8 kilometers away. Too far for him to fly using his jetpack. It would use up all of his hydrogen, which meant he would have to use what he had at hand to construct, well, to redesign his drop pod into a flying vessel. Not a big deal. Something he could do in his sleep. It would just take a little bit of work. So, he better get at it. First things first, he needed to have power for his grid. Which meant he would have to put down a windmill, because a battery was just wasteful, especially for a structure he was planning to move later. Then he could place down the assembler. Assembler in place. Now all he had to do was weld it all up. Thankfully, he believed he had enough parts now. Or even if he didn't, he could still dig a little deeper into his hole. Yes, time to weld away, he thought. Late in the middle of the night, LordMaddog finally finished welding up the assembler and immediately went ahead and told it to build large steel tubes. Then quickly thought better of it. He would need a lot of steel and the different resources from his survival kit first, so he went back and retrieved them quickly. And then decided to queue up the atmospheric thrusters. With the assembler humming and whirling away happily, LordMaddog breathed a sigh of relief. Probably the hardest part about his entire mission, besides actually building a capital ship able to take on an experimental military base, was over. Now, he strolled lazily on back over to his drop pod and decided he should probably choose the best place to place the thrusters. Slowly and carefully making his way back down into the hole that he had dug with the drill, he stared at his ship for several moments, wondering where exactly should he put these atmospheric thrusters. After a bit, he decided the best location would be right next to the drill. 2 on the front should be enough to lift him up and pushing out backwards. If it wasn't, he could always add more later. And the top priority was indeed getting the ship out of the hole. thrusters location decided and basic frame placed, he trotted his way back up towards the assembler to grab the assembled parts, only to get there and find out he didn't have enough resources for all the parts he needed. Figures. He'd have to dig a lot more, which means digging either by hand or getting his drop pod even more stuck in the dirt. At this point, though, he didn't feel like digging by hand, so drilling down deeper would be what he would do. He'd deal with the consequences later. Plus, it was better this way. If his ship was more or less buried in the dirt, it was less chance of the pirates seeing him. No, that wasn't the real reason why he was doing this. It was just out of pure laziness, the truth be told. And he knew he would regret it later. But he was also quite sure in his own piloting capability that he could extricate the dropship from the hole. At least, he hoped he could. He may end up regretting this tenfold. He thought, as he once again used his drill to dig out a side tunnel out of this ever-increasing pit his drop pod has stuck itself into. After fiddling with the production menu on the drop pod for several moments, he realized he was once again going to have to wait for his machines to finish producing the parts. But he wasn't a very patient person. No, LordMaddog liked to get things done here and now. So, despite not having enough parts, he ran back and forth trying to weld up the thrusters on the front of the ship, even though he didn't have the pieces he needed to finish the weld. Oh well, that's just sometimes we're impatient, aren't we? After flailing, welling, and squawking at the stupid machine for several minutes to speed up, and constantly queuing up and unqueuing components for no other reason than just because he was impatient, the machine finally produced the parts he needed. With components in hand, he raced back down towards his pod, so fast that he smacked his head against the top of the cave he had dug. Ow! He thought to himself as he got himself down to the hole and welded up the thrusters. Seeing that nice little spray of air coming out from the hot atmospheric thrusters warmed his heart as he hopped into the cockpit and tried to extricate himself from the hole he had dug. However, after several minutes of fiddling around, he realized he had well and truly gotten himself stuck. Hopping back outside of the cockpit, he looked around and decided, well, my laziness got me into this mess. Now my hard work will have to get me out. And began to dig away with his drill at the stone. So much for not having to use the hand drill again, hey? An exhausting half-hour later, he had finally drilled all the dirt around the area away and was certain he should be able to pull his dropship out. But first, to make sure nothing went wrong, he raced over to the assembler, grabbed a few steel plates, and went back to the dropship, placing 5 steel-plated blocks down on the backside to work as a bumper, just in case he crashed into something as he tried to back up. Not that he would, but it was always best to be safe. You know, just in case. Safety blocks in place, he dug his way back down to the front of the cockpit where he had removed the drill to remove the extra weight from the device so he would have easier time maneuvering, and hopped back into the cockpit. Slowly, he tried to remove the ship from the hull once again. He made it farther off the ground this time, but since he could not see out behind him in his current predicament, he couldn't see what was stopping him from leaving the area. After several tries, he hopped out and looked around again, only to find some weird physics anomaly. A piece of dirt was hovering in the middle of the air, where it shouldn't have been. Thinking to himself, that is odd. He grabbed his drill and removed the piece, then hopped back into his cockpit. Now, with the piece gone, he was certain he could get out of this predicament his laziness had got himself into. Ha! He shouted to himself as his vehicle landed back on solid ground. He was a bit worried there for a moment, but his excellent pilot skills seen him so. After thoroughly examining the ship, turning it this way and that, making sure everything was in absolute tip-top perfect working order, he hopped back out and decided to remove the two forward-facing thrusters and replace them with the ones that had originally been there. To his surprise, however, as he welded the thrusters back together, the ship took off, leapt into the air, and started to fly off backwards. In desperation, he hopped in the cockpit and tried to stop it, but still the ship floated farther and farther away from his stationary grid. Struggling with it, he was trying to figure out what in the world was with the physics on this planet. They are odd. He had never seen such a thing before. And still struggling against it, constantly struggling against the pull that seemed to pull him backwards and farther away from his grid. He nearly pulled the hair out of his head trying to figure out what was going on. But no matter how much he struggled with it, he couldn't stop it. So, eventually, he just sat there, watching the world swoosh back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. No matter what he did, the controls did not obey. Back and forth, they constantly went, until at last he had finally had enough. Turned the ship back around and flipped it on its head. Fine, he declared. If the laws of aerodynamics do not wish to work properly on this stupid planet, then I will have to use wheels. He was not happy about the declaration, but sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. And so, with much complaining about the weird effects jump drives were having on the entire galaxy, he began the long and lengthy process of adding wheels to his ship. To make things worse, he would also have to dig some dirt by hand, because he definitely did not have enough resources or large steel tubes, mainly large steel tubes, to weld together a set of 3x3 wheels. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he finished welding up the last of the wheels, then casually walked back around and hopped into its cockpit, and then very carefully tilted his ship back, and poop, it went, landing on its brand new wheels. Yay, he thought to himself, I have a Segway. Though most people in this time period wouldn't even know which he was referring, as he drove his ship back up towards his stationary grid. After taking several moments to readjust and refine the controls of the wheels, he hopped back out of the cockpit for what seemed like the umpteenth time that day. At least he had a functional vessel still, despite all that had gone wrong. Now, he needed to refine its shape to put on more hydrogen thrusters, atmospheric thrusters, because he didn't have the ice. He would much rather actually use hydrogen thrusters, but he didn't have any ice, so that was not a possibility. So, jumping on top of the ship, he quickly ground down the pieces he thought were an excellent place to put new atmospheric thrusters. One facing forward, one facing back, and then one facing to the left and right. Now, thanks to the hydrogen thruster he tore apart earlier, he would have just enough grids to construct each and every single one of them. And as he worked, his mind strolled off to the mission. It still took quite a bit for him to believe that the military had the capability of seizing control of all civilian vessels in the sector. What they would need such technology for, he hadn't a clue, but it had certainly backfired at this time. He just couldn't help but wonder how many ships he'd have to fight his way through to get at the military base. Hopefully it wouldn't have to be all that many. Building large ships wasn't that hard, but it was super time consuming. And the longer it took him, the more ships the pirates would seize. It was an infinite conundrum. Well, he would just have to do his best to make sure the pirates didn't know he was there. Otherwise, this would get a lot more complicated. Cling slammed home the last piece of the atmospheric thruster on the rear aft of his ship. He sighed with relief. Now his vessel was skyworthy. All was left to test it out and make sure all the settings were correct. Hopping into the cockpit, he flipped through the switches, quickly made a group, and put all the thrusters in it. Things didn't quite go as he planned, though. As he hit the switch, the forward-facing atmospheric thrusters roared to life. Or rather, the ones that on the forward end of the ship roared to life, and nearly flipped the entire ship over again. Apparently, the aerodynamics on this planet were still a bit wonky. He struggled with the controls for several moments, until he finally bought enough time to flip through the switches and once again turn off all of the thrusters. With all of the thrusters off, the ship settled down, but still remained to shake and quake in the weird physics of the planet. Such a pain, he thought to himself. Scientists claimed up and down that there was no such thing as weird physical anomalies that were constantly being reported all around the galaxy. But he himself knew better. He had experienced them multiple times, especially with working with pistons and rotors. At long last, the weird anomaly seemed to pass, and he turned back on his atmospheric thrusters. His ship slowly floated up into the air, just as it should, and he felt a sense of joy as he hovered there. Yes, he had done it. His vessel was now flight-worthy. He had several things he needed to do, though, before he ran off towards the trading outpost. First, he had to re-add the drill to the front of the ship to gather enough resources so he would have leftover materials just in case he needed to repair something. So with that in mind, he finished welding up the drill, hopped back in his ship, and went around to have some fun digging up some dirt with wheels and thrusters. Oh, this should be rather easy, he thought to himself as he gathered the dirt. And then, as soon as he was certain he had a sustainable amount of resources for the flight, he hopped out of his ship, marched on over, and said goodbye to his grid, grinding each piece down until there was nothing left. Then went over and deposited all the pieces he had in his inventory into his drop pod, and hopped in and took off towards the trade station. And I do believe that is all we have time for today. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Space Engineers. If you have, likes, shares, and comments are always welcome. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button, because there will be more to come. LordMaddog, signing off.